2:14 in the morning, a security camera in a quiet Ohio office building stopped recording time itself. The hallway kept moving. The dust kept drifting. But the clock on the screen simply refused to move forward, as if, for 5 minutes, that one hallway had slipped out of the rest of the world. What the guard on duty did next would follow him for the rest of his life. And what the camera caught, frame by frame, still doesn't have an explanation. Daniel Reyes was 34 years old, and for almost 3 years he had worked the overnight security shift at a mid-sized medical records office on the outskirts of a small Ohio town. He was a broad-shouldered man with short, buzzed dark hair and a 5 o'clock shadow that never quite went away. Dressed most nights in the same navy blue security uniform with a laminated badge clipped to his chest pocket. His job was simple, almost boring. Sit behind a desk, watch 16 small monitors, and make sure nothing happened. For nearly 3 years, nothing ever did. He'd seen raccoons in the loading dock, employees who forgot their badges, the occasional couple sneaking into the stairwell after hours. Nothing that ever kept him up during the day. That changed on the night of October the 14th, a night that started exactly like every other night before it. It happened at 2:07 a.m. Camera 7, the one covering the hallway outside the old records archive, skipped, just for half a second, like a heartbeat, missing a single beat. Daniel almost didn't notice. He'd seen glitches like that before. Old building, old wiring, nothing unusual. But something about the stillness on that screen made him lean forward anyway. The hallway looked exactly the way it always did. Beige walls, a flickering light near the far end, closed doors on either side. And yet, it felt wrong, in a way he couldn't quite name. The way a held breath feels wrong, right before it's released. Daniel rewound the footage, frame by frame, and there, buried inside that half-second skip, was something that made his stomach turn. A tall, narrow silhouette stood dead center in the hallway. Arms too long for its body, head tilted just slightly too far to one side, as though its neck didn't work the way a neck was supposed to. It existed for exactly one frame. Then it was gone, and the hallway looked empty again. Daniel told himself it was a compression artifact, a shadow, a trick of a tired mind at 2 in the morning. He kept telling himself that, right up until the timestamp on camera 7 stopped moving completely. The clock in the corner of the screen read 2:14 a.m., and it simply stayed there, not paused. The hallway lights kept flickering. The dust kept drifting through the air. Everything else in the image was still moving normally. Only the numbers had stopped, frozen mid-second, as if that one hallway had quietly detached itself from the rest of the timeline. Daniel checked every other camera in the building. All 15 of them showed the correct current time. Only camera 7 had fallen 5 minutes behind the rest of the world, and it was refusing to catch back up. Daniel reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder, then stopped himself. Building protocol was clear. Any suspected equipment failure had to be physically verified before it could be reported and logged. He didn't want to walk down there. Every nerve in his body was telling him not to. But it was 2 a.m. He was alone, and it was, technically, his job. He unclipped the flashlight from his belt, checked that it worked, and stood up from the desk slower than he meant to, his chair scraping loud against the tile floor in the silence. The walk from the security desk to the archive wing normally took less than a minute. That night, it felt endless. Daniel's flashlight beam swept across beige walls and closed doors, his footsteps echoing louder than they should have in the empty corridor. Halfway there, the temperature dropped so suddenly, his breath came out in a visible cloud, as though he'd stepped into a walk-in freezer without a door. The overhead lights dimmed to a sickly yellow-gray. and at the far end of the hallway, exactly where the frozen frame had shown that impossible shape, the air itself seemed to bend, a faint shimmer like heat rising off summer asphalt, except the whole corridor had turned ice cold. Daniel's flashlight beam hit the shimmer directly, and for one impossible instant, the shape from the footage was standing there in person, tall, too tall, its head cocked at that same unnatural angle, as if studying him from a perspective no human neck could achieve. It didn't breathe, it didn't move, it simply existed in a way that felt fundamentally incorrect. Like something had taken the general idea of a person and built it without ever understanding what a person actually was. For 3 full seconds, neither of them moved. Then, exactly like it had on the recording, it simply stopped being there. No footsteps, no sound, just absence, where presence had been a heartbeat before. Daniel didn't remember the walk back. He was simply there, at his desk, chest heaving, hands shaking too badly to hold his coffee steady. He checked camera 7 again. The timestamp read 2:19 a.m. now, moving normally. The hallway looked completely ordinary, as if the last 5 minutes had been quietly deleted and patched back into place. He might have convinced himself he'd imagined the whole thing, except the recording was still running the entire time, and it had captured every second of what he'd just lived through with his own eyes. He forced himself to rewind the footage and watch the entire 5 minutes from the beginning. The frozen timestamp, the shimmer forming at the end of the hall, and then himself walking into frame, flashlight raised, stopping dead in front of something the camera simply refused to render clearly. No matter how he adjusted the brightness or the contrast, the space where the figure had stood remained a blur of pixelated distortion, as if the recording itself couldn't process what had briefly stood inside that hallway. It was, he would say later, the single most frightening piece of proof he had ever seen. Evidence that actively resisted being looked at. Daniel called his supervisor, a woman named Renee Colston, 52 years old, a black American woman with graying hair pulled back into a low bun, who had managed the building's security contract for over a decade. He expected her to laugh, or tell him he'd been working too many doubles. Instead, there was a long silence on the line before she said, quietly, "Camera 7, the old archive hallway." It wasn't a question, it was a confirmation. She told him this wasn't the first time someone had reported something in that corridor, and that the last guard who'd walked down there alone at 2 in the morning had put in his 2 weeks' notice the very next day, and never once explained why. Renee explained what she knew. Decades earlier, before the current building existed, a records office had stood on that exact plot of land, and it had burned down in a fire that trapped 3 employees in a hallway with no working exit sign. The new building went up less than a year later, built on the same foundation, the hallway reconstructed almost brick for brick in the same layout. At the time, nobody thought it mattered. Buildings get rebuilt on old footprints all the time. But Renee admitted, on certain nights, when the building was empty and silent, it felt like that hallway hadn't forgotten what happened to it. Renee told Daniel to lock down the archive hallway for the rest of the night and stay away from camera 7 until sunrise. He agreed without arguing. For the next 4 hours, he kept his eyes fixed on every screen except that one. But every so often, out of the corner of his eye, he caught it flickering, the timestamp jumping backward 2 or 3 seconds before correcting itself, like something on the other side of that hallway was quietly testing whether the door really was as locked as they'd told it to believe. When the morning shift finally arrived, Daniel handed over his notes without mentioning what had happened, unsure anyone would believe him, and unwilling to say it out loud again just yet. He drove home as the sun came up over flat Ohio farmland, and for the first time in almost 3 years on the job, he found himself checking his rearview mirror, the entire drive, half expecting to see something tall and thin, sitting silently in the back seat, its head tilted just slightly too far to one side. Daniel quit 2 weeks later, without ever giving management a real reason. The footage from that night was reviewed once, logged as an unexplained equipment malfunction, and quietly filed away. Camera 7 is still mounted in that same hallway today, still pointed down the same stretch of beige wall and closed doors. The current overnight guard says it hasn't glitched since. Not once, not in months. But she also says that on certain nights, when the whole building goes completely silent, Camera 7's small red recording light dims for just a second before brightening again. All on its own, and she makes absolutely sure she never walks down that hallway alone. Security cameras are supposed to be the one witness that never lies, never imagines, never gets scared. They simply record what's placed in front of them, exactly as it happened. Which is exactly what makes a night like this so hard to explain away. Because if a machine with no fear and no imagination managed to capture something impossible, then maybe the only question left worth asking is this: what else has your own camera recorded quietly that you simply never looked at closely enough to see? If this story kept you up a little tonight, you know what to do. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and check your own cameras a little more carefully this week. We'll see you in the next one.